It's okay. You're there, I'm here. Nice flowers.
So, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. Thank you for being here. For those of you who are too far away, get closer. There are a few empty seats here, and it's very uncomfortable to see empty chairs. So get closer. It will be much warmer, cozier, nicer.
I promise we won't bite.
Okay, no, we won't bite. Although, you know, on reflection, who knows? Okay, let's be serious. We are privileged today to have at the IMF with us the United Nations Deputy Secretary General. And at the United Nations, there are not many Deputy Secretary Generals, there is one. And here she is. Amina, thank you very, very much for being here with us. For those of you who do not know Amina, she's from Nigeria. She had a distinguished career in the private sector first. Then she became advisor to various administrations, and that means a lot because you go from one regime to another and one government to another, but you stay and you continue to advise on issues such as poverty, such as sustainable development, and you were in charge of coordinating significant projects in Nigeria. And you had a stint at the United Nations in 2002-2005. But I remember vividly asking around to try to find out who would be a super talented woman who could join my team here at the IMF. And it was in late 2011. And somebody said to me, "Pity, she has just been taken by Ban Ki-moon." And that was you.
Thank you.
So you never know where life is going to take you. But life certainly took you to the United Nations. And you were, by all accounts, and those who are closely or remotely associated with the exercise, you were certainly regarded as the mother of the Sustainable Development Goals. I was personally a witness to your efforts in corralling, cajoling, pushing, nagging all those countries around the world that were skeptical, doubtful, and eventually you managed to convince them around this masterpiece that was a bit of a mess when you arrived, wasn't it? I don't want to remind you those days, but it was all over the place, and you managed to bring a bit of order, logic, and I will ask you to actually take us through that logic and the pillars and the various angles or axes that really structure the Sustainable Development Goals. And then after that, you went back to Nigeria, and you were Minister of Environment for 1 year until the UN, remembering how good you were, actually snapped you back to New York. And since that, Secretary General Gutierrez has appointed you as the UN Deputy Secretary General. So before we go into our conversation, I think we have the privilege of a little film which you have brought with you, which describes a little bit the Sustainable Development Goals. So please have a look at the screens. It's going to be on display now, as I understand. Well, thank you so much. It's a combination of good news, bad news, isn't it, that presentation? So can you just tell the audience, and many of them are already converted, but still, Tell us a bit more about the Sustainable Development Goals, how you propose to go about it in terms of changing this fact about, you know, so many people still in extreme poverty, despite the huge progress that has been made, so many children who still die, and despite the good progress that has been made, and so on and so forth. How do you see that, and how do you propose that?
We try to tackle it. Well, thank you very much, Christina, for having me. Well, you know, the SDGs were birthed from the success of the Millennium Development Goals, and even those 8 were thought to be impossible. And it's, you know, great to have Jeff in the audience, Sachs, because if I was the mother of the SDGs together with many others, certainly he was there right at the beginning shaping the MDGs. We recognize that goaling and bringing people together with a response to try to deal with health, with education, with poverty, did have the glass some full. And so we did have successes. And when we started to talk about what would the response be for the Sustainable Development Goals, the Sustainable Development Agenda had been discussed for 20-odd years and never sort of came to be. And looking at it to say that, yes, it is about poverty and that social pillar, but it's also about the economy, it's about environment, governance, and the partnerships. And how could we bring the MDGs into a space where it would create an opportunity to discuss what should the narrative be, what should we not take for granted, and have a world engage with, because this is not a legally binding document. How can we say what we take for granted is what we want to respond to? And that's when we began the conversation with the SDGs. It took 4 years to shape it. And we started from, late Kofi Annan said to us, when you're doing this, please don't forget the unfinished business of the MDGs. So we began to address poverty in all of its dimensions and to really look at the issues of inequality, to see that what was it that were rights and that were services that needed to be at the core of it. But at the same time, how are you going to do that sustainably? How are you going to do that with a consideration for the environment, but also within the economies? How are economies going to be inclusive? What were we going to do to ensure that when revenues were realized, that somehow the governance system saved us and we could plow them back into service delivery for health, for education, water and sanitation. So when you see the shape of the frame, it is about us, first of all, saying we still have huge numbers that are living in poverty, in hunger, inequalities. But there is a difference from the MDG era. We now have a context, and the context are varied, and it's a universal agenda we want to look at. And in that universal agenda, the context was migration, climate change, the conflicts that we didn't recognize anymore as a war with, you know, 2 warring parties. There was terrorism. You don't see the face of it. In 1 minute, it is an obvious Boko Haram terrorist. On the other hand, it is a suicide bomber, and you just really couldn't get your hands around that. But look at the root causes and what could we do in this agenda to address it. And that's where the 17 goals came, a response to how to address it. Seeing the unfinished goals, the first 6 are the MDGs. Seeing the economic piece, where the investments need to be, and what the world is looking like. I mean, to cities, for instance, where we will mostly be in the next few decades. How did we address that and put it on the agenda? And it was pretty tough to put that on the agenda. Having looked at that, again, the climate agenda, should that be siloed and separate, or an integral part of what we do? Because, you know, for a long time, it was first climate skeptics are still there. But then everyone's saying, well, how is that possible that this should be part of the economy? This is something that should be added on. I have to tell you, when I went back to Nigeria as the Minister of Environment, it was, my state was saying, was the environment they gave you, that's the dustbin lady. They didn't even get that, you know, environment was broader than just waste disposal. And then if you see a difficult part of this, how are we going to finance this? This is a huge agenda. But it wasn't talking about any more add-on to an economy. It was talking about getting to the insides of it. How does the whole of a country look at development from its resources, its potentials, and use them to achieve results that would be these 17 goals? People wanted 8 goals, 10 goals, 12 goals, but if you want someone to own this agenda, it has to be reflected as such. And I think that this, for us, when we look at it, everyone around the world that I work with, in business and civil society, governments, all recognize themselves in the goals. When you begin to unpack them, in your work. And I'd say to this audience, take yourself after 5. You're one of the 7.5 billion. And think about what world it is that we're in today and what it could be in the next 10 to 15 years.
Can I just stop you? Can you explain the 5 and the 7?
The 5 and the 7?
That you just mentioned.
Oh, 9 to 5. Or maybe you work from 8 to 5 here, but 9 to 5 are the working hours. So remove yourself from your working hours and go home and be one of the 7.5 billion. And really think about the world that it is that you live in and how you can come back to 9 to 5 to contribute to making it sustainable. Because the way that it is going today, it is absolutely not sustainable. What is happening with climate change is a result of the way in which we choose to live. It is about lifestyles. It should be more about the livelihoods of the many that don't have. Is it necessary? It's about our wants and not our needs. Is there something we can do about our consumption in a way to make it more sustainable? Yes, absolutely. So really some thought of how you can make your work far more useful in your life thereafter, because it will affect yours, it will affect your children, and as they say, future generations. So just to make the connection, because sometimes I think we work in our little silos, in our little world, doing really well at what we do, but not drawing the implications to what it is outside of that. And I think that's the most important thing for us in the UN is there's a really stark reality out there of the challenges. Then there's the aspirations of an amazing agenda that came together with climate in Paris and Addis. That's an aspiration. There's a huge gap. And our job is to try and close that gap and to have a conversation here on what's your role in trying to help close that gap. The SDGs?
Yeah, the SDGs.
Absolutely.
So the SDGs are 17, aren't they?
They're 17, and you'll probably say, many say, what's your favorite? And, you and I will grab onto gender. But they're not. I will always refer to my kids. I've got 6, and every single one of them special, but together they're just amazing. So I think that you do have priorities, you do have areas that you work in, but see them, any one goal that you pick up, see it as a docking station for the other 16. If you pick up 2, for the other 15. But they do feed other goals, and the goal that you have will feed the others. So it really is to get out of the box of the silos and to try to make the connections. It is more efficient, it's more responsive, you're able to do scale in a way that you can use resources better.
What do you see as the major challenges going forward in terms of trying to implement the 17 principles?
I think it's very difficult for each and any country to try to do this on their own. As I said, many of the issues that they have internally cross borders, and so therefore the externalities are real for how that affects them. So multilateralism itself is about us trying to do things together. Mm-hmm. That's really under stress. Today, I think, the speak is more about what we can do for ourselves and not, to reach out and to bring all the expertise, to bring the partnerships that we need so that we can deal with these issues. We cannot deal with migration in Europe unless we have the partnership, not only of those in Europe, but those across from where many of those migrants come from, and who would probably be happy in their countries if they had an enabling environment and they could stay.
Sure.
So a lot of that is I think that's the biggest challenge that we have is convincing what is obvious, and one would say it's common sense. It's not very common. How we can do these things together. You've been doing that here for decades. We have been doing that across the road at the bank, in the UN. But I think we have to become much more joined up at the country level. And part of what we're doing in the UN today is about the reforms, not just to become more responsive, efficient, and joined up in the UN, but how do we actually do that with international cooperation? How does it become a value and impactful, and that the results that we get can be felt, and that they're not just about pilots? I think if there's one thing that we know is, what the problem is, and we do have the solutions, but we've got to get together to do them, now. The urgency is clear.
Before I jump to the collaboration between the UN and the IMF, which there is, and which we're trying to demonstrate, including on very practical projects that we've worked on, do you think that there is also a path that we need to identify and find the narrative for, which would actually start from the international, the global issues that we face, you know, pandemics, terrorism, tax havens, you name it. But where we identify what it means nationally, what it means domestically for countries, because, you know, we can't expect some country leaders, and probably many country leaders, to have this holistic view, number one, and to be holistically minded. They're going to be accountable to their electors. They're going to be looking at the next stage of their life. And we need to actually establish a connection between those mega issues which require global multilateral solutions and what it means to them, what it means in terms of their budget, in terms of their policies, and how they can actually improve their situation by at the same time tackling some of the global issues. And do we do that well, or so well?
I'll start from the last bit. No, we don't do it very well, which is why I think we've got to address that new narrative.
Yeah.
At the country level, I can say as a former Minister of Environment, what we got from the international community is a cacophony. It was not a symphony of response to help us get to where we needed to get to. Everyone had a different position and angle to how they were going to support you with bits of money. If the money could have come together around one position, a common country analysis that would really get behind where the gaps are, we perhaps would have got much further. It happened to me when we were trying to take up the opportunity of looking at the Paris Agreement and saying, well, let's actually test the instrument on the green bond and see if we can do that in this country. It was an exercise to try to look at governance issues. It was an exercise of trying to get sectors to work together. It was an exercise of seeing whether business would have the confidence to come and partner with us. And it was, in fact, the stock exchange with the sustainability principles that first approached us, having worked with the United Nations Environment Programme. But when we decided to address it, because the question I asked, is it possible for Nigeria to produce a domestic green bond? Yes, it's possible, but it's really difficult. Okay, it's possible, let's go for it. And I think the greatest challenge I had was to try to get support in a coherent and coordinated manner from the international community. So I think we have to set a new narrative for that we are all about getting behind a government in an organized way to do this, and that everyone does have a mandate, has a specialty, and that if we can find how we are mutually reinforcing that agenda would be better. We would have got to, you know, the end of a 2-year trial much sooner. Lots of, you know, response for support. You can have 10 consultants and you can have this for 3. It's not what I needed. What we really needed was people to sit around there and say, this is the best response, so that we could convince our sectors to work with us and the Minister of Finance actually to get behind this idea that she was going to have to include this in her budget. So that's one piece of it. I think the other is to show that we're there for the long term.
Yeah.
I don't think that we do that enough. Because the international community in there for the longer term to help a developing economy grow is that thread that pulls through different administrations. I mean, we talked earlier about the administrations that are there forever. Those are not the ones we particularly want to target. But those that are trying to engage with democracy and are changing every 4 or 5 years. There are policy somersaults, there's instability, there is throw the baby out with the bathwater when the next administration comes along. And I think that, you know, one of the reasons we succeeded with the debt relief that Nigeria got from the Paris creditors was because we had the MDGs. And that's, I think, why, you know, reappointment upon reappointment for different presidents for me was that the MDGs spelt this, you know, long term that no one would argue was a good thing.
I would add something. It was also caused by another Nigerian woman.
Yes, absolutely.
Because I was on the other side of the table of Ngozi for that negotiation,
yes.
and my goodness, she carried the water for Nigeria.
She did. She did, but she also brought about, and I think, you know, those of you in the room that might remember when we argued our policy support instrument. For the first time, one of the indicators there was the MDGs. It was incredibly difficult to get that past you, but she did. And I think it was one of the best things that happened, because every time we came to measure what we were doing, whether it was with data or the results and the impact, that indicator was up there, and they were asking, so on the MDGs, what have you done in terms of achieving results with the, you know, delivery of water to people and hospitals and schools?
So on the IMF is not really part of the United Nations. We regard ourselves as very closely associated, affiliated. We are very close cousins, whatever you want to call it, but we're not directly part of the UN. Yet we try to work together, and we try to cooperate and bring our expertise and our skill set and the brain power and the efforts and the contacts that we have and the outreach to countries to the UN whenever we can. Jeff Sachs is with us. He was certainly very engaged in suggesting that we do a costing exercise with a few pilots in order to identify what would be the fiscal cost and burden and other financing eventually needed in order to develop and implement the Sustainable Development Goals. So this is something that we are working on, that we will be completing, that we will be presenting to the board in a few days and hopefully later to the United Nations, and which we are very happy to put together. In that area and elsewhere, how can we do more to help?
I think already there's a lot of work that's been done where we look at the results in the labour market and what we can do to help strengthen that, work with the ILO, and I hope that we can increase that. I know that we are looking to see, when we say organise more effectively at the country level, how can we pick this work up? There's a lot of discussion around how to integrate the social protection floor into the work that we do together. It is important that we are looking at the public resources are always going to be important, and so is ODA and the private sector. But I think we still haven't yet got the solutions, so I hope that the work that we do together will open up that space to think more of how to leverage that, how to bring that in. I mean, as I was coming up from New York, some of the concerns that came from the meetings that we had in China just recently, and the reports that we have, the debt issues are really big. I mean, having experienced what it was to Ngozi to get debt relief, and it took her a few years to convince people, we're now back again in my country with a level of debt that is worrying, but it's happening all over. Africa. Is that the way we want to go? And I think that we really need to sit down and have a better conversation about all the asks of a growing economy that needs to be inclusive. It needs to succeed because stability is needed more than ever today across our countries and where we're working. So I think that working with your regional technical assistance teams that you have, our regional level that is looking again at the regional economic commissions to see how we can better respond. And then at the country level, we're redesigning our frameworks. We don't think that they have been inclusive enough with our other partners. For instance, the common country assessments that we do to try to frame a response that is coherent. They're all different. What the World Bank does, the IMF, the EU, what we do, even what we do within. So to try to get a front there that we can sit with government and we can look at people. So what are the priorities of a government? It's not their plans. Their plans are, relatively speaking, we say many plans are there that have been assisted. You'll see a country's priority in their budget. That's where their priorities are, and they're very
That's typically what we also look at carefully.
Yes, really carefully at the budget. But I have to say we haven't done that. We look at the plans in the UN, and those plans are carefully articulated, but they are visions, they're aspirations, and the reality of what a president or a government will put their money behind, you'll see in the budget. And it's often very far from what the realities are to try to achieve the SDGs. They often have to make a choice between investing in infrastructure, because that infrastructure you can touch and feel as a dividend of democracy, or in the service of health and education. These are choiceless choices. They should be able to do all of it. And we should be there to try to assist and see how we can, over time, achieve that.
You see, on that particular, well, two things. One, there's, because I see that Vicky is here and so are some other members of the Fiscal Affairs Department, we also do a lot of work on domestic revenue mobilization and support to those countries which in Addis decided that not only was ODA necessary, but some of their domestic mobilization was needed. So we do a lot of technical assistance on that front. There's the UN, IMF, OECD, World Bank platform, which is doing some frameworking, you know, which is fine, which is doing some conferences, which is fine. But I think the technical assistance work that is done, the regional centers, I see Charmine is here with us as well, is, you know, value that we try to deliver to the governments in order to actually, you know, improve their revenue collection and improve also their ability to determine whether yet another new project with financing attached to it is actually going to help or hurt them, and that's, you know, those are techniques that we're trying to propagate, communicate, and share with countries, debtors and creditors alike, and that's certainly something that we've seen in the last year, where China, you know, and other countries, but China certainly is much more aware of the necessary sustainability of a country in terms of debt, of the necessary macroeconomic assessment of where it's heading before it helps financing what we call the white elephant projects. And, you know, those ones, we're not particularly keen to support them. And we see
I think, Christine, there's all the more reason why we need to speak together. Because I think that we see on the SDG agenda things that people should have as a right, and that right to development. But it needs to be in a sustainable way in which we can have those conversations with you that are the custodians of the macro. And that doesn't happen. Development happens with the Minister of Development. It comes down spoon-fed from the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and there's a disconnect with the Minister of Finance. And I think we have to bring all of that conversation together. And some of the work that you're doing now I think is really helpful, particularly when we see a lot of what we cannot sustain is weak institutions and governance at the local level. And this is a place where there's a huge opportunity for us to get the revenue right. There's a lot of activity happening there. A lot of it's informal. The informal sector is something in many countries we've not managed to grapple with. And I think that the potentials are huge, but we do need to do it together. We need to find the instruments and the tools that could help us to deliver education better. Education's not just bad quality and not available, it's in crisis. And we're already dealing with 2030, 2050, 2100, when things are going to look very different when you see what's happening with technology and artificial intelligence, and which jobs are going to be there, which ones are not. So who are we training for? What are we trading with? And for. And so I think that there are many unanswered questions, and this is helpful for us to come into the same room to begin to bring, I would say, the assets we have and share them, so that we can give the best to many countries which do make a difference, whether they create stability or instability. I come from a part of the country in Nigeria. Boko Haram was born there. I went to primary school there. We didn't have Boko Haram. Terrorists are not born. And we see how exclusion, the drying up of Lake Chad, corruption, many, many things came to create that perfect storm. And I think that we were just not attentive at the time. I mean, it was not that we didn't have resources, but we did begin to, you know, look at a country and its governance, in its structure, in dividing it up more and more, and thinking that we were being more representative as we became smaller, and creating more institutional hemorrhaging, I would say, of the human resources that we had, until in the end, where I had a birth certificate, today the average child in Nigeria does not have a birth certificate, simply because a local government doesn't have the capacity to deliver. So I think there's a lot that we could talk about. You know, as we speak up here, we need to also be thinking about what do we need to do to get that moving at that level. And for the most of it, it affects half of populations and, I would say, economies that are not realizing their potentials, and that women. Women at the center.
You take me to the next topic. Yep. That's perfect. Because for those of you who are following, Sri Mulyani earlier today said Asia will belong to women, or the future of Asia belongs to women, which I thought was an interesting proposition by Sri Mulyani. But you know, then she explains what she means, and it's very clear. You know, the female labour participation in most Asian countries is in the range of 50%, when it's over 80% for men, and on and on. And the whole list is available for you to read if you're interested in what Sri Mulyani is clearly giving as a narrative pre-Bali meetings. I think she will come out strongly on that page. Tell us about, you know, initiatives
on gender.
that you are taking on gender. By the way, the Secretary General, I think yesterday or Monday, announced that you now have in the leadership team 24 women and 20 men. Is that right?
Yes, the gender bit went the other way. Now men are looking like endangered species. We should clap for that. Antonio Guterres is our #1 feminist. We will always say that loud and clear, because what he availed from day one was an opportunity for us to actualize it. He put it out there that not only did he say it, he wanted it to happen. So left and right of him is a woman, his chief of staff and myself. Sometimes he said, oh dear, where are the men? But he keeps saying, you bring something for him to approve as a head of agency, is it a woman? And so he's made a concrete effort to try to ensure that we do have parity. That is the fourth, the unspoken member states did not ask us for reform and gender parity, but that's his. So for senior management, yes, parity. For the resident coordinators that we have that coordinate the assets of the UN in 129 countries, we have parity. So that's been good for us.
How many people do you have around the world?
Around the world, I think we are 40,000. 40,000, okay. I have to say that 40,000 around the world. I mean, my biggest surprise was when I landed in Denmark the other day, and we have a UN city. It's a wonderful eco-building in Denmark, in Copenhagen, and 2,000 people turned up, and these are all working for the UN, but the majority of them part of UNICEF and its logistics support to the humanitarian. So our humanitarian piece is very large, as is our peacekeeping. Development's smaller, but I think much more concentrated in the developing world, and now we have to sort of think globally to some of the issues. An example, for instance, today on the health agenda, mental health is probably one of the biggest challenges we see for young people. And so Secretary General has taken that up as a priority on the health agenda. But coming back to our gender parity, I mean, this is, it also opened up the question about, how we take on youth, young people. And in that exercise, we found that we are way behind. So we talk about women and glass ceilings, but actually for young people, it's concrete. The average age of entry into the UN is 45.
What?
Yep, it's 45. So it's young.
Many of us here in the room would agree with that.
But it is also, we just lifted the age of retirement. And so we got more old people for longer. That's the story today, and we did not see that. So when we came up with the gender parity, we had to address that and to say, okay, this has got to happen over time, and every step that we take now has got to make sure we open the door. So we have a youth envoy, and we have an effort to look at the rosters and the pools to bring in younger people, particularly at national level with national staff. The gender parity in the system is much more difficult to achieve in the Secretariat. On one side, it's okay. Administration, development, these sides are relatively easy to get. We can find the skill sets, but really difficult on peacekeeping. And this has been a challenge to us, especially in the field. And we know that unless we get gender parity, that partnership between men and women will not give us an enabling environment to say, for instance, zero tolerance is achievable for sexual harassment and abuse.
When you say peacekeeping, it's staff of the UN. It's not peacekeeping support that you're getting?
It's staff of the UN. It's staff of the UN. We're not...
So not including those people who are made available to you
we encourage
by countries?
It, but we don't have a say on it. They are troop providing nations and
reporting to their respective countries, at least from a management point of view.
Yes.
Okay.
So on that, we've been looking, at source, how do we, encourage that skill set to come forth? And my discussions the other day, an incredible woman, Minister of Foreign Affairs in one of our Nordic countries, but in her not-so-past life, she was a Minister of Defence. And so I was asking her, where do you think we can make the investments in making sure we try to get parity in the field and in peacekeeping? And two things that she said was in communications and intelligence. This was a place that she thought could happen pretty quickly, and we could begin to address that. So it's been a lot of thinking through results. if we said that we promised to deal with this, how are we actually going to come up against the challenges? It hasn't been easy. I think one of the things on both the challenge of gender parity, but also on challenges like sexual harassment and abuse, we have got to do a better job of talking to the men. I've been in many retreats where it is probably 70% men, and to say to them, you know, we're going to do gender parity, and they all agree, and then you say to them, well, you know, many of you will not have a job tomorrow because they're going to be filled by women. That's difficult. That's really difficult, and it's not one that we've paid much attention to. Recently, I will have people coming to me to say, well, you know, what do we do with this expertise? Because these are really good men, and you know, so, well, really good women were left out for a very long time, and there's, you know, never been a situation where a country or an organization, you know, flew on half a wing. And I think that's what we've been doing for a very long time, not taking the advantage of two sides. But I do think we need to have a conversation with men, because this does affect them in ways that perhaps we haven't.
Do you have early retirement programs that can be made available?
We've started to introduce them, but you know, not everyone wants to retire. People want to work. I mean, people coming into the UN are serving humanity. This is a vocation. So they don't want to stop working.
Sure.
So I think that we have to have a better conversation within the multilateral system and to see what other opportunities there are. But it's a very big wake-up call to some of the constraints, yeah.
You know, following up on women SDGs and Srimulyani's point, do you think that improved parity, better female labour force participation, closing the gender gap in all sectors and in all countries, not just in developing countries, will actually serve the delivery of the SDGs?
Absolutely. I mean, I don't think that there is a better way than to bring the other half to the table. I think that, you know, we do it as a matter of it's good for the bottom line, it improves the ambition and the quality of the response that we get in the results that we'll have, whether they're education or thinking through the way cities will figure in the future, what we do with renewable energy. I mean, no one knows better the burden of the tasks that happen outside in an economy, an environment where there is no power. And so when you're really looking at what you do with power, that transition to renewables is important, that we're there having that discussion. I think, you know, a lot of the time the gender piece has always been, is this what we add on? Is this a feel-good thing? I tick the box and I've done gender. Well, gender is men and women, so it's to find that comparative advantage of each and to ensure that that partnership itself is strengthened to deliver on the results, and not just to think about the numbers that we have to fill that happen to be women.
But how does it effectively happen? Because, you know, we are doing yet more work and additional research in that field. And if I look at the financial sector, for instance, we are still stuck with, you know, 2% of female CEOs in the financial and banking sector, 20% female in staff at a sort of managerial level. And yet you talk to the lead bankers of this world and you explain to them that their bottom line would be much improved, that their security would be much better, then they would have more reserves, and that their risk profile would be advantageously defended by women, and yet it doesn't change.
You know, like you, I heard you say that you didn't believe in quotas before. I didn't either. I still question them in all circumstances, but I think we have to find an opening where we judge your success as well by the number of women you bring in to that space, and not for the sake of it, but, you know, really talking about skill sets that matter, that you can get. If it's a choice between a man and a woman, to take a woman where there is that space in order to get the best out of it. We're not doing that. It's the same, you know, when the banks in Nigeria were told by the central bank, you have to have a department that deals with agriculture and you will be measured on the number of women that have access to credit. Otherwise there is, you know, some, you know, repercussion there. Suddenly we had women accessing credit. And I think that we have to find the incentives and put them in there to ensure that we are in those places. I do think there has to be some, you know, exit strategy. And it's not every woman that wants to go in there. I mean, I think that a lot of the time when we were looking at many of the educated women to come into public sector work in our countries, it was very difficult to get them because the sacrifices you have to make in those environments are huge. But then we started to find places in the public sector that were more amenable. In the private sector, I think that, you know, we have to get more women at the board, more women owning companies, so that, you know, we start to set a trend. I left being an employee to become an employer because I was going to start a family. And I just knew that I could never hold on to a husband and a family if I continued the job I was doing. So by becoming an owner of a company and an employer, we just set the rules. And it used to be, we all traveled a lot because that was the nature of our work. And so I would insist that the 4 men that were with me in our board, I was the only woman, that they take their wives with them. And so, you know, I had
Did you take your husband with you?
No, I took the nanny. The baby.
Far more useful sometimes, yes.
I was just looking for the opportunity to justify the ticket I had to pay. So she was my husband and came with the baby for the first 2 years, every one of them. But, you know, that was just trying to be creative. I didn't want to miss out on doing, you know, exclusive breastfeeding.
Did you see this crazy controversy, by the way, in New Zealand? You have to look at it. I don't want to spend too much time on that, but it's unbelievable. She's the second prime minister to have given birth while in office, after Prime Minister Bhutto. And there's been a huge controversy about the fact that she flew on a particular plane to be able to breastfeed, and the cost that it's just unbelievably stupid.
I think you have to remind the men that, you know, there isn't one that hasn't been born of a woman.
I think it's very cruel for them to be remembered. That,
you know, they have to. I mean, mothers and sons. You know, I really think about that dynamic after 5. Yeah. Bring it into the workplace.
Now, I'm going to turn it over to the audience so that I'm sure they have questions. But before I do that, and while they're moving to the microphones or they are thinking about their questions, do you feel that the confidence that we all need and the trust that we need from our membership, do you think that that can be improved, repaired, that it's under serious threats and growing?
Yeah,